Now that your husband is dead, pack your bags and leave, my daughter-in-law said across the dinner table just 7 days after we buried my husband. My son didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He simply lowered his eyes and took another sip of iced tea. In that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, not shattered, just quiet. The dining room suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour earlier. The oak table my husband Robert had refinished with his own hands seemed to stretch for miles between us. The casserole dish sat untouched in the center of the table. The candles I had lit out of habit flickered softly beneath the air vent. 1 week earlier, this same room had been filled with neighbors, cousins, church friends, and casseroles delivered with sympathy cards. Now it held only 3 people, and somehow I had never felt more alone. This house is too much for you now, Vanessa continued. You should move somewhere smaller. Somewhere practical. I looked at her carefully. 41 years old. Perfect hair. Perfect smile. The same woman I had welcomed into our family 15 years ago when Ethan introduced her as the love of his life. The same woman whose bridal shower I hosted in this very house. The same woman who used to call me Mom. And where exactly do you expect me to go? I asked quietly. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Ethan before answering. There are plenty of nice retirement communities around here. Retirement communities. The phrase landed harder than I expected. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how prepared she sounded saying them. As if this conversation had already happened many times before. Just without me. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, we're only trying to help. I turned toward my son. My only child. The boy who used to run through this house wearing baseball cleats and tracking mud across my kitchen floor. The boy whose broken heart I comforted after his first high school breakup. The boy whose college tuition Robert and I spent 15 years saving for. Help me, I asked. By asking me to leave my home? Ethan looked away. That hurt more than anything Vanessa could have said. Dinner ended shortly. Afterward, nobody raised their voice. Nobody cried. Nobody apologized. I carried my plate into the kitchen and washed it by hand. The water ran warm over my fingers while their voices drifted faintly from the dining room. They thought I couldn't hear them. They were wrong. The sooner she agrees, the easier this will be, Vanessa whispered. We can't keep waiting forever. I stood perfectly still, staring at the kitchen window above the sink. Outside, the backyard looked exactly as Robert had left it. The bird feeder, the maple tree, the stone path leading toward the garden. Everything looked normal. Everything except my life. Later that night, I packed a small suitcase. Just enough clothes for a few days. I didn't leave a note. I didn't start an argument. I simply walked out the front door before sunrise. The next morning, I sat alone in the lobby of First National Bank while rain tapped softly against the windows. I was there for a reason Robert had mentioned years earlier. Something he told me never to worry about unless life became complicated. When the bank manager finally appeared, he greeted me with a look of surprise. Then he opened a file, glanced at the paperwork inside, and suddenly his expression changed. He looked up at me and said words that would change everything. Mrs. Wilson, are you aware of what your husband left you? The bank manager's question lingered in the air long after he spoke it. For a moment, I simply stared at him across the polished mahogany desk, convinced I had misunderstood. The rain continued tapping against the windows behind me, soft and steady, while people moved through the lobby carrying umbrellas and briefcases. Life outside continued as normal. Mine had apparently taken a different direction. I am sorry, I said carefully. What exactly do you mean? The manager glanced down at the file again. Mrs. Wilson, according to our records, your husband established several accounts and legal arrangements over the past decade. Most of them became fully accessible to you upon his passing. My hands tightened around my purse. Robert had always handled most financial matters. Not because he excluded me, but because that was simply how we divided responsibilities during 47 years of marriage. I managed the household. He managed investments. We trusted each other completely. There must be some mistake, I said. My husband never mentioned anything unusual. The manager offered a polite smile. Actually, he left very detailed instructions. He slid a folder across the desk. My name was written on the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing it nearly took my breath away. I had spent the last week surrounded by reminders of him. His coat still hanging in the hallway. His reading glasses beside the recliner. His coffee mug resting near the kitchen sink. Yet somehow his handwriting affected me more than any of those things. It felt personal, immediate, alive. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents, account summaries, property records, and a handwritten letter. My vision blurred before I even finished the first page. Robert had spent years preparing for possibilities neither of us wanted to imagine. He knew that one day one of us would be left behind. He wanted to make certain the survivor would never be dependent on anyone else's kindness, especially family. I sat quietly for several minutes. The manager respectfully gave me space. As I turned page after page, a picture began to emerge. The house, the investment accounts, several certificates of deposit, a trust. Everything had been structured carefully and legally. More importantly, everything belonged entirely to me. Not jointly, not conditionally. Me. The realization left me both comforted and unsettled. Comforted because Robert had protected me. Unsettled because Ethan and Vanessa had spoken with such confidence the night before. They acted as though the house was already theirs. As though my future depended on their approval. Suddenly, certain conversations from recent months returned to me. Vanessa asking questions about property taxes. Ethan casually mentioning home renovations. Discussions that seemed harmless at the time now felt different. The manager eventually spoke again. Your husband also left instructions that this folder be given directly to you and only to you. I nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like Robert. Thoughtful, careful, patient. Outside, the rain had begun to lighten. Sunlight pushed through the gray clouds in thin silver streaks. I looked down at the handwritten letter resting on top of the stack. The envelope remained sealed. I traced my finger across Robert's name. For the first time since his funeral, something other than grief stirred inside me. Clarity. Not anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. I finally understood that the conversation at dinner had not been about helping me. It had been about removing me. The difference mattered. I slipped the folder back into my purse and thanked the manager for his time. As I stood to leave, he handed me a business card. If you have any questions, call me directly. I thanked him again and walked toward the exit. The rain had stopped completely. The parking lot glistened beneath the morning sun. Before getting into my car, I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at the sealed envelope one more time. Then I carefully opened it. The first sentence Robert wrote made my heart stop. Margaret, if you are reading this, someone has already shown you who they truly are. I read the first sentence 3 times before continuing. Robert's handwriting remained steady across every line. The same careful script I had watched him use for decades when signing birthday cards, writing grocery lists, or leaving notes beside the coffee maker. Margaret, if you are reading this, someone has already shown you who they truly are. Believe them. My throat tightened. I sat alone inside the car, while sunlight slowly pushed away the last traces of morning rain. The world outside looked brighter than it had the day before, yet every word in that letter revealed shadows I had failed to see. Robert explained that he had updated his estate plans several times during the previous 10 years. Not because he expected trouble, but because he believed preparation was a form of love. He wrote that people often change when grief, money, or opportunity enter the same room. At the time, I smiled sadly at the sentence. Robert had always possessed a quiet wisdom that seemed almost frustratingly accurate. As I continued reading, memories surfaced one after another. Small moments, harmless moments, or at least moments I once believed were harmless. Vanessa asking detailed questions about the property's value during a Thanksgiving dinner. Ethan suggesting that maintaining the house would become difficult for aging homeowners. Conversations about retirement communities that appeared random at the time. Each memory now felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Robert had noticed those conversations too. He mentioned them directly in the letter. That was what startled me most. He had seen the same pattern long before I did. Near the middle of the letter, he instructed me to contact a specific attorney if circumstances ever became complicated. The name was familiar. Daniel Harper, an attorney who had handled several legal matters for Robert years earlier. Robert even included a personal phone number written in blue ink beneath the paragraph. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I sat quietly for several minutes, staring through the windshield. For the first time since the funeral, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what remained. My judgment, my dignity, my future. When I finally started the car, my phone vibrated. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom. His voice sounded uncertain. Where are you? I looked across the parking lot toward the bank entrance. Out. Silence followed. You left pretty early this morning. I needed some time to think. Another pause. Vanessa was worried. The statement almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded so rehearsed. Was she? I asked. Ethan hesitated. We just want what is best for you. There it was again. The same sentence. The same carefully polished concern. I glanced at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. I appreciate that, I replied calmly. I will be making some decisions soon. Ethan seemed relieved by my answer. Good. We can all sit down together and discuss options. Options. Interesting word. Not plans. Not wishes. Options. As though my life had become a committee project. Perhaps, I said. I will let you know. After we ended the call, I drove toward a small hotel on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where I could think clearly without interruptions. That afternoon, I unpacked my suitcase, ordered a cup of tea from room service, and called the number Robert had left in the letter. The attorney answered on the second ring. When I introduced myself, his tone changed immediately. Mrs. Wilson, he said gently, I have been expecting your call for quite some time. Expecting my call. I repeated softly. I sat near the hotel window with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Everything looked ordinary. Yet nothing in my life felt ordinary anymore. Daniel Harper paused for a moment before answering. Robert came to see me several times over the last few years, he said. He was not worried about finances. He was worried about you. I looked down at the letter resting in my lap. Why would he be worried? Another brief silence followed. Because he noticed things. His words settled heavily in the room. Not dramatic. Not shocking. Just undeniable. I thought back to countless family dinners over the years. Vanessa steering conversations toward money. Ethan asking increasingly specific questions about the property. Small comments about downsizing. Suggestions disguised as concern. At the time, I had dismissed them. Families discuss practical matters. That was normal. But hearing Daniel speak made those memories feel different. Robert never accused anyone of anything, Daniel continued. That was not his nature. But he believed patterns matter. And he paid attention to patterns. I closed my eyes. Robert had always been observant. He noticed when neighbors changed routines. He remembered birthdays without reminders. He could tell when something was wrong long before anyone said a word. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation from nearly 3 years earlier. We had been sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Vanessa and Ethan had just left after dinner. Robert remained unusually quiet. When I asked what was wrong, he smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wondered what he had seen. Daniel asked if I could meet him the following morning at his office. I agreed immediately. After ending the call, I sat alone for a long time. The room felt peaceful, cleaner somehow. For the first time since the funeral, my thoughts were not clouded by grief. They were guided by questions. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a message from Vanessa. It was surprisingly cheerful. She hoped I was feeling better. She said everyone was concerned. She suggested meeting for lunch to discuss my future plans. I read the message twice before setting the phone aside without replying. Something about her sudden warmth felt rehearsed. The concern arrived too late and too perfectly. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The hotel room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. I made coffee using the small machine on the counter and watched dawn slowly brighten the horizon. Robert used to love mornings. He always said sunrise revealed things darkness tried to hide. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting across from Daniel Harper in his office. He was older than I remembered, his hair mostly gray now, but his eyes remained sharp. A thick folder sat on the desk between us. My name was printed on the tab. Daniel folded his hands carefully. Before we begin, he said, there is something important you need to understand. Robert did not prepare these documents because he expected conflict. He prepared them because he wanted facts to protect you if conflict ever appeared. Then he opened the folder. Page after page revealed records, notes, legal filings, and dates. As I examined them, a picture slowly emerged. Conversations, requests, financial inquiries, property discussions. None of them illegal, none of them dramatic. Yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. By the time I looked up from the final page, my hands were perfectly still. The confusion that had followed me since the funeral was gone. In its place stood something much stronger. Understanding. And for the first time, I realized Robert had not left me helpless. He had left me prepared. The folder remained on the desk between us long after. I finished reading the final page. Daniel did not rush me. He simply sat quietly, allowing the information to settle. Outside his office window, people moved along the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that my entire understanding of the past several years had shifted in less than an hour. I looked down at the documents once more. There were records of conversations Robert had documented, notes about meetings, summaries of discussions regarding the house. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract attention on its own. But together they revealed a steady pattern of interest in assets rather than people. Daniel finally broke the silence. Robert loved his family, he said carefully. That never changed. But he became concerned that some relationships were becoming increasingly transactional. The word stayed with me. Transactional. It explained something I had struggled to describe for years. The gradual change had happened so slowly that I barely noticed it. Family dinners became discussions about property values. Holiday visits became shorter. Phone calls arrived more often when decisions involving money needed to be made. Looking back, I realized that many conversations centered around what I owned rather than how I was doing. Daniel slid another document toward me. There is something else you should know. I adjusted my glasses and began reading. The document outlined several protections Robert had established. Legal protections, financial protections, measures designed to ensure that no one could pressure, manipulate, or remove me from my own property without my direct consent. The more I read, the more I understood why Robert had seemed so calm during his final years. He had quietly built safeguards around our future, not because he expected the worst, but because he believed peace came from preparation. He trusted you completely, Daniel said. He wanted you to have freedom, not dependence. Freedom. The word felt unfamiliar after the past week. Ever since the funeral, I had been treated like a problem to solve, a responsibility to relocate, a situation requiring management. Yet sitting in that office, I remembered something important. I was not helpless. I never had been. After leaving Daniel's office, I drove to a small diner a few blocks away. Robert and I used to stop there on Saturday mornings after running errands. The place had not changed in years. The same red booths, the same smell of fresh coffee, the same waitress who somehow remembered everyone's name. I ordered a bowl of soup and sat near the window. As I ate, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Vanessa. Another message. Friendly. Polite. She hoped I was resting. She suggested meeting later that week to discuss practical arrangements. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. For the first time, I noticed something curious. Every message focused on arrangements, plans, logistics, and property. Not one asked how I was coping after losing my husband of nearly 5 decades. Not one asked whether I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether I was lonely. The realization was strangely freeing. Painful, but freeing. Because once you see something clearly, you no longer waste energy pretending it is something else. That evening, back at the hotel, I organized every document Daniel had given me. I placed them neatly inside a folder and locked them in the room safe. Then I sat by the window watching the sun disappear behind the horizon. The city lights gradually appeared one by one. My grief remained. Losing Robert still hurt with every breath. But alongside that grief stood something new. Confidence. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable confidence. For the first time since leaving home, I was no longer reacting to events. I was preparing for them. And somewhere deep inside, I had the feeling that Ethan and Vanessa still believed they controlled the story. They had no idea that Robert had spent years making sure they did not. The following morning began with an unexpected sense of calm. For nearly a week, every day had felt like walking through heavy fog. Grief clouded my thoughts. Shock distorted my judgment. But now, as I sat in the hotel breakfast area with a cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, something had changed. The facts were finally beginning to replace the confusion. Robert had prepared for this. Daniel had confirmed it. The documents proved it. The only question that remained was how far Ethan and Vanessa were willing to go. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Mom," Ethan said. "We really need to talk." His voice sounded different. Less confident. More urgent. "About what?" I asked. "About the house. About everything." I stirred my coffee slowly. Everything is a very large subject. He sighed. Vanessa found some listings for retirement communities. We thought maybe we could visit a few together this weekend. There was that word again. We. As if the decision had already been made and only the details remained. I am not available this weekend, I replied. Silence followed. Why not? The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because he seemed to believe he was entitled to the answer. I have appointments, I said simply. Appointments? Yes. Another pause. With who? I looked out the window toward the parking lot. A family was loading suitcases into an SUV. A little girl laughed as she chased a balloon across the pavement. Life continued moving forward. Professionals, I answered calmly. Ethan did not respond immediately. Mom, what is going on? The concern in his voice sounded genuine for the first time in days. But even genuine concern arrives differently when trust has already been damaged. I am simply taking care of a few matters, I said. That is all. After ending the call, I drove to the house for the first time since leaving. I parked across the street beneath a large maple tree and sat quietly behind the wheel. The property looked exactly as it always had. The flower beds Robert planted every spring remained neatly maintained. The front porch swing moved slightly in the breeze. From a distance, it looked like the home of a happy family. Then I noticed movement near the garage. Vanessa stepped outside carrying a folder. A few moments later, a real estate agent joined her. My hands froze on the steering wheel. They stood together near the driveway discussing something while the agent pointed toward different areas of the property. The front yard, the side, entrance, the backyard gate. I watched for nearly 15 minutes. No one knew I was there. No one expected me to be there. Eventually, the agent left. Vanessa returned inside. I remained parked beneath the tree long after the car disappeared. The sight should have shocked me. Instead, it confirmed what I already suspected. The conversations about retirement communities. The pressure to leave. The urgency after the funeral. None of it had been spontaneous. Plans were already forming before Robert was even gone. That afternoon, I called Daniel and described what I had seen. He listened carefully before speaking. Do not confront them, he said. Not yet. Why? I asked. Because information is more valuable when people do not know you have it. I thought about that long after the call ended. Years ago, I would have driven straight home demanding answers. But grief changes people. So does betrayal. By evening, I sat once again beside the hotel window watching the city lights appear one by one. Somewhere across town, Ethan and Vanessa were probably discussing their next steps. They believed they were moving closer to their goal. What they did not realize was that every move they made was revealing exactly who they were. And for the first time, I was paying attention. Over the next several days, I followed Daniel's advice and did nothing that would alert Ethan or Vanessa. At least, that was how it appeared from the outside. In reality, I was busier than I had been in years. Every morning began with phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. Daniel introduced me to financial advisors who had worked with Robert. He arranged reviews of every document connected to the property, the trust, and the accounts Robert had established. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. My husband had been far more thorough than I ever imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing records in Daniel's office, I discovered something that made me sit back in my chair. Several months before his passing, Robert had added specific instructions regarding the house. The language was simple but unmistakable. No sale, no transfer, no restructuring, no refinancing. Nothing could happen without my direct authorization. Daniel noticed my expression. He wanted to make certain your wishes remained the deciding factor, he explained. I nodded quietly. The realization brought comfort, but it also brought sadness. Robert had spent years protecting me from a possibility I never believed would become real. Meanwhile, Ethan continued calling. Sometimes twice a day. His messages grew increasingly persistent. He wanted updates. He wanted meetings. He wanted to know when I planned to return home. Each time, I remained polite. Each time, I shared very little. I am still taking care of a few things, became my standard answer. Vanessa eventually stopped pretending concern and shifted toward urgency. One message informed me that decisions needed to be made soon. Another suggested that delaying discussions could create complications. The wording caught my attention. Complications for whom? Certainly not for me. A few days later, Daniel received information from a professional contact that confirmed something important. The real estate agent I had seen outside the house had already prepared preliminary market evaluations. Nothing official had been listed. No laws had been broken. But the interest in selling the property was clearly moving beyond casual conversation. When Daniel shared the information, I felt surprisingly calm. Weeks earlier, the news would have devastated me. Now it simply reinforced what I already knew. That evening, I drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench overlooking a small lake. The water reflected the colors of the setting sun. Families walked along the path. Children fed ducks near the shoreline. I remembered bringing Ethan to places like this when he was young. He used to race ahead carrying pieces of bread while Robert laughed behind him. Those memories still mattered. They always would. The difficult truth was that loving someone does not prevent them from disappointing you. As darkness settled over the lake, my phone rang once again. Ethan. This time, his voice sounded frustrated. Mom, why are you shutting us out? I listened quietly. We are trying to help. There was that sentence again. The same sentence that had become almost meaningless. Through repetition. Help with what? I asked calmly. He hesitated. Your future. I looked across the dark water. My future seems to concern everyone lately. Silence filled the line. Then Ethan spoke more softly. Vanessa thinks we should all sit down together. I almost smiled. For the first time, I wanted that meeting too. Not because I needed guidance. Not because I needed permission. Because I was finally ready. That sounds like a good idea, I said. Let us arrange something next week. The relief in his voice was immediate. He believed progress had finally been made. After we ended the call, I sat on the bench for several more minutes. The air felt cooler now. The lights around the lake reflected across the water like scattered stars. Somewhere across town, Ethan and Vanessa were probably celebrating what they viewed as cooperation. They believed I was returning to the conversation on their terms. What neither of them understood was that the conversation had already changed. The woman they expected to pressure into surrendering decisions no longer existed. And very soon, they were going to discover exactly what Robert had spent years preparing me to become. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon. Vanessa insisted on hosting it at the house. According to her message, everyone would feel more comfortable discussing important decisions in a familiar environment. I agreed immediately. The location did not matter to me. What mattered was that the conversation would finally happen in the open. The morning of the meeting arrived clear and bright. I woke before sunrise and sat quietly with a cup of coffee by the hotel window. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely calm. Not because I expected kindness. Not because I believed misunderstandings would suddenly disappear. I felt calm because uncertainty no longer controlled the situation. Facts did. Around noon, Daniel called. Everything is ready, he said. Are you comfortable moving forward? I looked at the folder resting beside me on the table. The same folder that contained Robert's letter, legal records, trust documents, and property protections. Yes, I answered. I am. Ready. The drive to the house took 20 minutes. As I turned onto our street, familiar landmarks appeared one by one. The corner mailbox, the elementary school playground, the church where Robert and I renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. Every place carried memories. Yet when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something different. Instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. No one could take away the years Robert and I built together. Those belonged to us forever. Vanessa greeted me at the front door with surprising enthusiasm. Margaret, she said warmly, it is so good to see you. The performance was impressive. If I had not witnessed everything else, I might have believed it. Ethan appeared behind her. His smile seemed nervous. Mom. I hugged him briefly. He still felt like my son. That was the difficult part. Betrayal rarely arrives wearing the face of a stranger. We gathered around the dining room table. The same table where everything began. Vanessa had prepared coffee and pastries. She spoke about practical matters. Future planning. Property maintenance. Long-term care options. Her presentation sounded polished, organized, and remarkably rehearsed. Ethan mostly nodded in agreement. Occasionally, he added a comment about responsibility or convenience. I listened without interrupting. Eventually, Vanessa placed several documents on the table. We understand this is emotional, she said gently. But we believe these arrangements would make life much easier for everyone. Everyone. There was that word again. I looked down at the papers. Retirement community brochures. Preliminary housing estimates. Notes regarding property value. The house appeared repeatedly throughout the discussion. More frequently than family. More frequently than grief. More frequently than Robert. Finally, Vanessa folded her hands. What do you think? The room became very quiet. Sunlight streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating tiny particles of dust floating through the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I opened my purse and removed a folder of my own. Ethan frowned. Vanessa's confident expression softened slightly. I placed the folder on the table and opened it carefully. Before I answer, I said, there are a few things both of you should probably see. I removed the first document and slid it across the table. Ethan picked it up. His eyes moved across the page. Then he looked at the second document. Then the third. The color slowly drained from his face. Vanessa reached for the papers. Her expression changed almost immediately. The confidence was gone now, replaced by confusion, then concern, then silence. For the first time since Robert's funeral, neither of them seemed to know what to say. And as I sat there watching them read, I realized something important. The conversation was finally happening on equal terms. Perhaps for the first time in years. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the dining room wall. Ethan continued staring at the documents in front of him. Vanessa turned another page, then another. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had disappeared completely. Finally, Ethan looked up. What is all of this? His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I folded my hands calmly on the table. The truth, I answered. He looked back down at the papers. The property records clearly showed that the house belonged entirely to me. The trust documents outlined Robert's instructions in precise detail. Every safeguard had been legally established years earlier. Every decision required my authorization. There were no shortcuts, no assumptions, no opportunities for anyone to decide my future on my behalf. Vanessa cleared her throat. There must be some misunderstanding. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. There is no misunderstanding, I replied gently. Daniel Harper reviewed everything with me. The mention of Daniel's name seemed to end any remaining argument before it could begin. Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. For the first time, he looked less like a determined adult and more like the overwhelmed little boy I used to comfort after difficult days at school. Mom, he said quietly, we thought. His voice faded. I know what you thought, I said. That is the problem. Silence returned. Sunlight continued pouring through the windows. Dust drifted lazily through the bright beams. The house felt exactly the same as it always had. Yet the atmosphere inside had changed completely. Nobody was discussing retirement communities anymore. Nobody was talking about practical arrangements. Nobody was talking about what should happen to my home. Because suddenly the facts mattered more than assumptions. Vanessa finally spoke. We were only trying to help. I looked directly at her. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. Just honesty. When Robert died, I needed compassion. I needed family. Instead, I was told to leave my own home before I had even finished grieving. Her eyes dropped to the table. Ethan said nothing. I continued speaking calmly. Neither of you asked how I was sleeping. Neither of you asked whether I was eating. Neither of you asked what losing nearly 50 years of marriage felt like. You only talked about where I should go. The words hung in the air. Not harsh. Not loud. Simply true. Ethan closed the folder slowly. I am sorry, he whispered. For a moment, I believed he meant it. Perhaps he did. But some apologies arrive after damage has already been done. They matter. They just cannot erase what happened. I stood and gathered the documents. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa tried to stop me. Before leaving, I looked around the dining room one final time. The table, the windows, the photographs on the walls. Every corner carried memories of Robert. Memories built over decades. No legal document could create those memories. No betrayal could erase them. At the front door, Ethan followed me outside. The afternoon air felt warm against my skin. He stood quietly on the porch while I walked toward my car. Mom, he called. I turned. His eyes looked tired. Older somehow. Can things ever be fixed? I considered the question carefully. Then I smiled sadly. That depends on whether you want a relationship or an inheritance. He lowered his eyes. I think he understood. As I drove away, I did not feel victorious. Victory was never the point. I felt something much better. Peace. Robert had been right. People eventually reveal who they truly are. When they do, the most important thing is not revenge. It is clarity. The day I left that house, I thought I had lost everything. I was wrong. I lost an illusion. And in its place, I found the strength to stand on my own, the wisdom my husband spent years protecting, and the certainty that my future belonged to me. No one else.